Hi folks, my name is Mike Dobbs. I'm your host for this edition of Government Matters, and it's my pleasure and privilege to have the opportunity of speaking with Senator Ed Markey today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's a great treat to be here.
Senator Markey, there's so much going on. I've got a punch list here, and we're going to do our best within the next half hour to see if we can touch on a lot of this stuff. I want to note that you just came from Holyoke Community College, where you attended an event put on by the Collegiate Democrats. How was that?
There's more energy amongst young people than I've ever seen in my life. So what Donald Trump has done is he has absolutely unleashed a generational response, because these young people care about climate change, they care about gun safety, they care about income inequality, they care about the racist tweets and actions which the president has engaged in, and all of it has just led to this incredible outpouring of energy. I saw it here today amongst the college Young Democrats. They were organizing from the campuses of Western Massachusetts, but it's happening not just there, but everywhere. So I think that could be the X factor, the thing that actually tips the election next year. All of these young people who are they're energized, they're not agonizing, they're organizing, and I think it's going to make the difference in the election.
Two things that your statements just sort of trigger. Number one, let's just talk a little bit about the climate in Washington right now. As you and I were talking just a moment ago, it seems like all the president has to do to get to the top of the news cycle is to tweet out something outrageous. It seems to me that there must be a great deal of frustration in the Senate and in the House about trying to get things done, trying to move things forward, because you do not have that partner in the president of actually trying to get legislation that is needed in this country going. Healthcare reform is a prime example. Unfortunately, we still are in a situation that is not very good for many, many families here. So is it personally frustrating to you? Is it professionally frustrating for you and your colleagues in the Senate that not enough is getting done?
Well, yes, on the big issues, Trump is absolutely erecting a legislative wall, aided and abetted by Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader. So we want to have a debate as Democrats on the Senate floor on background checks for the purchase of guns, on assault weapons, on high-capacity magazines, even on research with regard to the causes of gun violence in our society. Mitch McConnell, at the behest of Donald Trump, won't even allow debates on the Senate floor. The same thing is true, by the way, on the climate crisis. We should be debating on the Senate floor the kinds of actions we have to take in order to respond to the science, which is clear, no longer really debated amongst scientists, but it is amongst the supporters of Donald Trump, meaning the Koch brothers, ExxonMobil, the coal companies. They don't want to debate. As a result, Mitch McConnell won't even allow that to happen. But again, it's triggered across the country, this response. So either they allow us to legislate over the next 12 months, or they're going to get voted out of office. That's my belief. I think young people are going to lead the charge, and by January of 2021, we'll be actually having real debates. We'll be able to move legislation on the big issues that the American people want us to be debating: healthcare, gun safety, protection of the planet from this climate crisis. All of it will be at the top of the list of things that we will be debating.
Let's talk a little bit about climate change. I know this is something that is very close to your heart. It's a very big issue with you right now as a senator, much less with your campaign for re-election. The New York Times just did a story about former Texas Governor Rick Perry with his tenure at the EPA. They quoted you in it. I thought it was a pretty nice quote. I'm sure that you could have said something far more harsh about Governor Perry, but the bottom line is that what has what has anything been done about climate change in the Trump administration? Has the EPA changed course in terms of fundamentally protecting things or advocating changes that would give us protections for the future?
Well, the EPA has actually just become every polluter's ally. That's what that agency has become under the Trump administration. So they're trying to roll back law after law. One of them that I have a particular interest in is the fuel economy standards of the vehicles which we drive in America. I was the lead Democrat along with Nancy Pelosi out of the House of Representatives in 2007 that passed the law that ultimately George Bush signed, that President Obama used along with the California Clean Air Act waiver to increase fuel economy standards to 54.5 miles per gallon by the year 2025. Well, Trump has now ordered the EPA to roll it all back, just freeze it at 2020 levels and not increase it at all, rather than saying, well, 54 is the beginning, then we'll go to 64, 74 miles per gallon to back out the oil in our system. And the same thing is true with regard to the efficiency of the power plants in our country. The fossil fuels which you use, coal, principally historically in the generation of electricity and substituted now with natural gas and wind and solar. Well, Trump is giving a reprieve to the coal industry, even though we know that that's a principal source of pollution. So those rules and regulations are being rolled back as well. So when you look for evidence of Trump caring at all, there's none. It's just the opposite, in fact. He's trying to roll everything back. And China and India, they take note. And they say, well, if you're not going to act, we're not going to take anything more than symbolic action ourselves. And so that puts the planet itself on a dangerous pathway because we have to be the leaders. The United States must be the leader. And if we're not, then ultimately, as we're viewed as laggards rather than leaders, the rest of the world will do the same, and the planet will become warmer and warmer, more and more dangerous. And this young green generation, they're going to get more and more angry that the preceding generations did not do the job to implement the new technologies fast enough to avoid the worst, most catastrophic consequences of climate change.
Is there legislation pending now that would address climate change that simply isn't getting any traction?
Oh, absolutely. I've introduced legislation for tax breaks for offshore wind so that they're given the same incentives that oil and gas and coal received. I've introduced a green bank that can be used as a way to give low-interest loans to municipalities like Springfield or private sector companies so that they can institute green strategies at low cost that can help to transform the economy, and that would ultimately leverage between $600 and $750 billion worth of investment in new technologies. So each of the areas can be covered. They can be protected. But you need a strategy. You need a plan. You need someone who is allowing for these debates to take place. It's really not a question of technology any longer. It's really a question of political will. If we had the political will, the technologies will be there in order to transform our economy.
So much when we talk about climate change, it's almost like a line of dominoes, because one thing can affect another thing, can affect another thing, can affect another thing. I know that, and you may not have seen it, but there was a report from the Massachusetts Department of Transportation talking about congestion in Massachusetts and what that means. And part of it is that we do not have enough mass transit to transport people efficiently, both from an energy and time point of view, especially in the greater Boston area. That almost ties in with climate change as well, because more cars are on the road. With more cars come more pollution. Climate change is just, I think that people don't understand how far it reaches into American society in terms of the way we live and the way we could live. I have to ask, do you find colleagues in the Senate still balking at the idea of climate change? I mean, are there people still who are debating whether or not the science is genuine?
Well, increasingly they say the right things, but ultimately there's an old saying that it's hard to understand something when you're paid not to understand it. Because such a high percentage of the money that goes into the Republican Party comes out of the fossil fuel industry, it's just hard for them to get around that fact and then to act on climate change. And as you're saying, when we talk about mass transit, talk about moving to very efficient, low greenhouse gas emitting transportation systems, that runs contrary, obviously, to what the fossil fuel industry wants. They want us to become even more addicted. So that becomes a real debate, over whether or not, as we do infrastructure bills, we're going to ensure that it's green, that everything we do is green. The roads that we build, the rapid transit that we might be building, the way in which we do it is all green, 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 green. It doesn't have to be a choice. It doesn't have to be 60 years ago where we're just paving over America and putting a white line down the middle of it. We've learned a lot now about what the impacts are of avoiding the environmental consequences of bad infrastructure policy. And we're still waiting for Donald Trump, actually, to produce his infrastructure bill. It's something that was at the center of his campaign in 2016. He kept saying, I want to make America, the infrastructure capital of the world. Once again, I'm going to introduce a massive bill. Well, I'm on the infrastructure committee. I'm still waiting for that bill to arrive so that we can have the debate and that I can then make my amendments to make sure that the infrastructure is built, but it's done in a way which is green, which is dramatically changed in terms of the way in which greenhouse gases are sent up into the atmosphere.
There's been a lot of talk from your colleagues in the Congress about green initiatives, and there's been criticism that somehow green initiatives would somehow stifle the economy, would stifle economic development. Do you see that as a side effect of this?
Well, one of the real comical parts of Donald Trump and his allies in debating the Green New Deal is they call it socialistic. My perspective is, what is the description that they have for 100 years of tax breaks for the oil industry, for the gas industry, for the coal industry? By their definition, that's socialism. Having the federal government help an energy industry is socialism. What we're saying is, give us the same permanent tax breaks for wind and solar, all electric vehicles, for storage technologies, for all electric buildings that they have been providing for multiple generations to the fossil fuel industry, and then we will win out in the marketplace. There's already been a dramatic spike in the deployment of wind and solar, of all electric vehicles in our society. If we are able to receive the same level of subsidies, of tax breaks, then the market will ultimately tilt dramatically in our direction, especially amongst younger people who will then have a much greater incentive to move the whole society in that direction. So I just think it's very hypocritical on the part of Trump and his allies to make those charges. We already have 350,000 people in America working in the wind and solar industry. There are only 50,000 coal miners left. So there are 7 times more in wind and solar than in the coal industry. And we believe that we can save all of creation by engaging in massive job creation. If we put the right regulatory and tax structure in place, we're going to actually wind up with millions of blue-collar jobs. This is going to be the greatest blue-collar job creation engine in generations in our country. And Donald Trump and his allies could not be more wrong. And the reason Donald Trump takes this position is obviously because that's where his campaign contributions are coming from.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the impeachment movement. I would kick myself if I didn't ask a member of the Senate that. Do you really think this is going to come about? Do you think that it's going to be a strong enough case? A lot of people are saying the Democrats are playing sort of a dangerous game because if we go through this process and Donald Trump is not removed from office because of it, then that gives him an incredible talking point to energize his base in the 2020 election. What do you think about all this?
Well, I think this is less about politics than it is about the Constitution. The Constitution is very clear in terms of what actions a president can take in his dealings with foreign nations. And all of the evidence that has already been revealed just in the last 10 days makes it very clear that President Trump was asking the president of Ukraine to actually dig up dirt on Trump's political opponent. And that is just so far outside of what our Constitution allows that it is imperative for the United States House of Representatives to begin an impeachment inquiry and to uncover all of the evidence and, if necessary, and I think it will be, to have the vote on whether or not he should be impeached. That would then lead to a debate on the floor, a trial on the floor of the United States Senate, in which I would be participating. I think that it's going to be absolutely imperative for the American people to hear everything that the State Department was asked to do, that his White House staff was asked to do, that our ambassadors, that his envoys were all asked to do in aiding and abetting his efforts to undermine Joe Biden as an opponent in the 2020 elections. And I think that even if there may be consequences that are unpredictable, that we still have a constitutional responsibility as the Congress to, in fact, engage in the process that could lead to his impeachment.
During his news conference the other day, he talked about that China should investigate. So he actually said before the media something that he has been criticized about going in violation of the Constitution.
The president somehow or other thinks that if he announces to the public that he's engaging in activity which is prohibited, that somehow or other he inoculates himself against the charge that he is breaking the law. But of course, he hasn't done that at all. He's only reinforced the need for us to have the hearings, to begin to debate on impeachment, because you cannot ask a foreign power to help you in your re-election as President of the United States. It clearly is something that could implicate the security of Ukraine versus Russia. It could implicate, because of the favor which he's asking from China, how strong our policy is towards China on a whole range of issues. We don't need our relationship with China or Russia to be compromised because of the personal political ambitions of Donald Trump. That's exactly what was anticipated by putting into the United States Constitution the responsibility in Article 1 for the Congress, to be the first agency, and for then in Article 2 for the president to faithfully implement the laws of our country. We here have a case where the president is not faithfully implementing the laws of our nation, and as a result, we have a responsibility, an historical responsibility, to conduct that investigation.
We talked a little bit about China just a moment ago. I always find it fascinating that the president would talk about China in that regard at the same time that we're involved in this trade war, which is having greater and greater implications on the American economy. State House News Service just did a story about the fact that Massachusetts lobstermen can't export lobsters to China. Apparently, China was a big market for Massachusetts lobsters. They're now having to sell them to a Canadian distributor, and then the Canadian distributor sends them to China. And though it might be very small in terms of overall the American economy, at the same time, it shows that these things have real implications for working people, for business owners. Do you see any sort of positive movement in this trade war?
Well, the example you raised is a very good one, Mike. The Chinese have imposed a 25% tariff on lobsters. That's why Senator Warren and I actually wrote a letter just a month ago on this issue. And I know up in the Massachusetts state legislature, they're looking at this issue as well. But ultimately, it's part of a federal trade policy. And the law of unintended consequences is then invoked, and lobstermen in Massachusetts are harmed. And I think that's the real problem that we have with Donald Trump. He's engaging in kind of madman trade policy. He thinks the more crazy he can act is somehow or other the better the ultimate result will be for our country, with no evidence thus far to prove that that's the case. So Massachusetts lobstermen are caught in the crossfire. So it is absolutely imperative for there to be a coherent trade policy. There are areas where the Chinese are clearly engaging in dumping policies, where they're clearly stealing our intellectual property. But there has to be some way in which the president implements a policy which is intelligible, right, and doesn't wind up with side effects that ultimately are worse than the original problem that he said that he was trying to correct. And as part of this, he winds up actually getting into a trade war with Canada, where the Canadians actually buy more of our goods than they export to our country. So just stepping back and looking at this madman theory, which he has, that somehow or other people just get so scared of him that they capitulate, well, the evidence thus far has not demonstrated that that's the case.
Right. I got to ask you about your reelection efforts. You have now got several opponents within the party. Did you anticipate that this would be a within the Democratic Party kind of challenge that you'd be facing?
Well, I welcome challenges. I welcome opponents as part of the re-election to the Senate back in 2013, just 6 years ago. Congressman Steve Lynch and I ran against each other in the Democratic primary to win the nomination so that one of us could become the United States Senator. So I think that it's something that is part of the process. I welcome them all, and I look forward to debating them. Now,
I've seen that you have already talked about debates, particularly one on climate change.
Yeah, so I would like all of the Senate candidates to come together to have a debate on climate on November 10th so that we can just kick off this Senate Democratic primary in a way which is respectful of the magnitude of the issues that we have a responsibility to deal with. The Democratic National Committee refused to have a debate on climate, just would not have one. My feeling is that Massachusetts is better than that, and we should lead on this issue. We're not just the Bay State, we're the brain state. So we should debate these issues, and climate, I think, should be right up front, and I'm looking forward to debating these issues with each and every one of my opponents.
Excellent. One of the hallmarks of this program here on Focus Springfield is we ask elected officials, what was the process like to enter into public service? So I want to ask you, what motivated you to go into public service?
Well, for me, just growing up, going to the Immaculate Conception Grammar School, Malden Catholic, there was a constant questioning that the nuns, the brothers, the priests gave to us, which was, how could you be of service? And I was not blessed with a vocation to become a priest. And so I was constantly looking then at what could be an alternative way in which you can serve. And so for me, public service was something that I was drawn to. Now, my father graduated from the vocational program at Lawrence High School. My mother was president of her senior class in high school, but her mother died. My grandmother died when she was 17. So she had to kind of be the homemaker, kind of a single mom for the household when she was growing up. So for me, I was the first person to ever go to college in my family. When I went to law school, the first lawyer I ever met was the first law school professor who walked into the classroom. But in my third year at Boston College Law School, I decided that really the calling and the use for the law that would be most attractive for me was in public service. So I ran for state representative for Malden and Melrose in my third year at Boston College Law School, and I won. I was 25. I was sworn in at age 26. And then 4 years later, I announced for Congress at age 29. And at 30, I won for the seat. I was sworn in as a congressman. And when I flew down to Washington to be sworn in, that was my first visit to Washington, D.C. in my life. I had never been there before. But it was all part of this desire to serve, to be able to play a role in helping families that I felt I had been a beneficiary of other people's work, my own family's. I know I had the opportunities that my mother and father did not have to go to college. And my goal is to democratize access to opportunity through education, healthcare, breaking down discriminatory barriers. And I've been fortunate to be given the chance through public service to help other families in the same way that mine was helped.
Senator, thank you so much for coming by. I hope we have this opportunity again during the next year or so. And folks, you've been watching Government Matters right here on Focus Springfield.